So we're here with my grandpa, Bob Richards, and it's March 16th, 2022. We're getting back into the swing of things. We are going to be doing another interview today. Just so people, if anyone's watching this, you're in a different location now, Grandpa, right?
Yes.
Yes, you're now living in Simi Valley, which is part of the reason we've had a big pause for the last month or so. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about,
ask. I can, and if you ask questions, it's easier for me to answer.
I know. I was just doing a little introduction for whoever watches the video, which people have been. So,
okay. You want to know about moving to the San Fernando Valley?
We've already talked about moving to the San Fernando Valley. So I wanted to get that part of your life. We're talking to early 50s because you moved to the San Fernando Valley in 1950.
That's right.
So two things I'd like to start off with, or we can start off with one or the other. As maybe start off with maybe the easier one. Where were you working during this time? I think you had said you were working for Lockheed, right?
Well,
Aircraft
actually, when I got married, did I ever talk about working at the auto glass shop?
Yes, we've talked about the auto glass shop a number of times.
Okay. When I got married, when I married Esther, I was working at the auto glass shop, and that was located on Lincoln Boulevard. But actually, that brings something else. Is how did I get to Venice, California?
Well, we've already talked about that.
The move to San Fernando Valley was preceded by a move to Venice, California, and that was actually before I married Esther. It really starts there, and what happened is one day one of my cousins, either Stan or Elizabeth, came up with GI houses. And what the GI house was, part of the World War II veterans benefits, which included education and housing and jobs. One day, somehow we found out that they were building GI houses with no money down in Venice, California, on Warren Avenue, which was about halfway between Pico Boulevard in Santa Monica and I forget the other street that was south of it. We went down to look at these houses, and we saw some models, and right away I wasn't really impressed with it. As an example, they had oak flooring, but when I looked real closely, I saw that the flooring had been finished before it was put down. Somebody had painted or varnished the flooring before it was put down, and it was not put down particularly well. There were gaps and seams in it, and I wasn't particularly pleased. But nobody else apparently saw it. Anyway, there was a small money deposit. I don't remember how much it is to reserve one of this. And this was in, I believe, 1948. I believe 1948. And so my sister and Dard bought a house, put deposit on a house. Stan and Liz both put houses on them. Stan was married to Betty then, and Liz was married to, well, his name escapes me right now. Anyway, we put the houses they were 2-bedroom houses. They were probably 800 or 900 square feet, not very big. And put the deposit down, and we were waiting to move in. I was living with my mother and Shirley and Dard on 8th Avenue in Leimert Park then. To shorten a long story, the houses were supposed to be ready in 4, 5, 6 months, something like that. This was in the winter, I believe, of 48. And pretty soon the summer of 48 came through and the houses were not started. Then the fall of 48 came and still nothing. We put deposits down on there. So I kind of grew tired of it. And I backed out of them. Eventually the houses were finished on Warren Avenue. Everybody moved in, and my mother gave up the flat on 8th Avenue. So she moved somewhere. I don't remember. And I moved in with my sister and Dard. And that's how we lived. Now, my cousin Dick became friends with a guy named, again, I can't think of his name. He had a brother-in-law named Henry, and they opened an auto glass shop on Lincoln Boulevard, just north of Warren Avenue. And what they did is they opened up in the size of a two-car garage, an auto glass shop. My time frame might be a little bit wrong here. They opened up the glass shop. In the meantime, I was working at Douglas Aircraft Company. Yeah, I think we talked about that. I'm trying to get my time frame. I went to work for Douglas Aircraft Company, then I quit. Did I talk about my going to school, A&E school?
Yeah, so if you want me to kind of catch you up to where...
Okay. This was a period when I went to school for a year and got an airframe and power plant CAA license. I've already talked about that, so I won't go back in that again. During the war, the Army Air Force probably trained 250,000 men to service the thousands and thousands and thousands of combat and training planes that we built during the war. And these people that they trained were basically who I had to compete against for a job. And it wasn't didn't look very good for me. So I needed a job after I gone to A&E school, and I got a job under the GI Bill, in which part of my wages were supplied by the government. I don't remember how much money I was making, maybe $40 a week or something like that. The upside is that I only had to walk a block to get to my job every morning. So I worked at the auto glass shop, starting in maybe 48, late 48. I've already talked about how I met Esther at a dance at the Park Manor ballroom, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so we talked
Okay.
about Esther, and then
Okay,
you
so
also talked about your like getting married to Esther and then
yeah,
moving to the valley. Basically, we got up to we discussed at
okay.
one point that that the war, basically the start of the Korean War, had
Okay. This
had had
this
made
was
it
on the day I got married. Late, we have to go a little bit earlier before that.
okay.
After when I married Esther, we went on a honeymoon back to see her relatives in Nebraska and Iowa. And when we got back, I went to work back at the auto glass shop. Uh, I'm not going to talk too much about working there, but I worked there from maybe mid 48 until just after I got married. Now, I got married, Esther and I got married on June 25th, 1950. And if you look at the records, June 25th was the day that North Korea attacked South Korea. We didn't actually know about it June 25th because we left on a honeymoon on June 26th. We hadn't seen any papers. We hadn't heard any news. So we started off on our honeymoon, and our first stop was Las Vegas. We got there on the afternoon of June 26th, still didn't see a paper, didn't know about the war. And the next morning, we got up and had breakfast, or we're coming out of a restaurant. And back in those days, they had newspaper stands in which you would put a nickel or a dime or whatever the price was in a slot above the paper dispenser, open the door and take out a paper. Well, I looked through these, saw that we, North and South Korea, were at war. Okay, right then, that wasn't very important to us, but that's how we found out from the war. Okay, we drove back east, back to the Midwest. We were gone almost 2 weeks. And we came back, and I went back to work at the auto glass shop. In the meantime, before we got married, did I talk about I think I talked about the small apartment we rented in off Western Avenue.
Yes.
Okay, we were living in this small apartment, and May and Sam were living somewhere closer to the beach area. I don't remember where, but in July or August of 1950, somehow they found out about GI houses in the San Fernando Valley. They went out there and they put a deposit on one. They moved in the fall of either late summer or the fall of 1950, and we would go out to see them once a week. We were still living in this flat, if you have your apartment. It's one, they took one apartment, a 4-apartment building, and they divided it into 8 apartments. So one day in early fall of 1950, we went out to see May and Sam. They had moved into their house earlier, and I think I might have talked about the phone system. They didn't have any phone wiring yet, so what the company did on the corner of each block in this small group of houses. They put a phone booth, so people could at least go out and make a phone call. Sometimes there was a line waiting for people to use a phone call. Sometimes the phone in the booth would ring, and then a passerby would answer it, and the caller would say, "I'd like to talk to such and such who lives someplace there." And if the callers or if the people that answered it lived in the neighborhood, they understood the problem and they wanted to get the people. Yeah, kind of a unique situation. Well, okay, but back to May and Sam in their house. One day, going to visit them in the early fall, they said, "There's a new housing project just off of White Oak, about maybe 4 or 5 blocks away." So we got in the car, we drove over there, and sure enough, that's what they had. They were starting GI houses. We looked at the tract, and there were roughly 300 houses along maybe 6 or 8 blocks from Van Owen Street south to Victory Boulevard, and White Oak on the north, or check that, White Oak on the east to Encino on the west. Total about 300 houses on 8 blocks, I think. We looked at a bunch of models and then went up and down the streets, and Esther saw a house. It had just been stuccoed, or check that. I think it was in the framing situation. And we did get out of that car. We drove. It was on May Place. We drove on there. We both liked it. And so we went back, put a deposit on it, and such was our start of living on May Place. We moved in late December of 1950. Now, we were in the, let's see, I have to go back a little bit now, because the war in Korea started in June. We got married. We were still living in Hollywood. And one day I either saw something in the paper or I heard an advertisement in the radio. I'm not sure which happened about needing the aircraft industry was very big in Los Angeles during the war. After the war, it sprang down to nothing. But now, with the war in Korea, things were very active, and I took a job with Lockheed Aircraft Service at a much larger pay than I was earning at the glass shop. And so I went to work for Lockheed Aircraft Service sometime in the fall of 1950. Before that, I think it was before we moved to the San Fernando Valley. And
So was that located at Burbank Airport at the time?
What?
Was that at Burbank Airport?
It was at the Burbank Airport. Lockheed Aircraft Service was a subsidiary of the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. They didn't build aircraft. They modified and overhauled Aircraft. They had 3 large hangars just off of Victory Boulevard. I went to work at a smaller establishment they had in Burbank Boulevard. I don't remember the street it was on, but what happened in there is the Air Force took about 300 P-51s out of storage to refit them for service in Korea. And what we had to do was take out stored overhauled aircraft engines that were in storage and set them up for mounting in a P-51 as the P-51s were rebuilt. This was all done at not at the airport, but at this place off of Hollywood Way somewhere. We had about 300 engines to do, and we were doing about 3 or 4 a day. So the job lasted maybe 7 or 8 months. And when it was over, then they moved me to the airport. And I worked at the Lockheed Aircraft Service until the fall of 1955. Then in 55, I was offered a job at Rocketdyne up at the Field Laboratory. And before this happened, Lockheed Aircraft Service had decided to move to an airport east at, I can't think of the community.
Like
This should be
Ontario?
long-term memory. I should remember. In any event, I did not move with them because that would mean upending my life and moving onto Ontario. I guess
I just said Ontario. I wasn't sure.
yeah, Ontario. It just popped in my head. So I chose to let Lockheed slide away from me, and I went to work at Rocketdyne.
Well, before we get to Rocketdyne, I don't know. I want to hear more about this. For the first 7 or 8 months or so, you were working on these engines. Were other engines, or they were originally out of these
No,
P-51s?
what happened? They were the Merlin engine after World War II ended. Some airplanes were scrapped. A lot of airplanes were sold, especially transport DC-4s and DC-3s. The DC-4s were, I think, were R3R, and the DC-4s were the R3R. The DC-4s were the R4Rs. I'm not sure. The P-50, there were a lot of P-51s that were scrapped, some of the old ones, but there were a lot were just stored in at places up on the desert. A lot of them were stored in Arizona, and what they would do is they would service them enough so that they could fly them to Lockheed, where they were dismantled and rebuilt. And the engines were rebuilt in a separate shop. And after they had been rebuilt, now they had to be fitted with all the associated gear, the engine mount, their controls, their cooling systems, their lubrication systems, and all that. They had to be put in a package where the airplane was put on a mount. This whole package could be mounted to the front of the aircraft. Then when they put a cowling around it, that's what you saw. So we were mounting the engines in their mounts, and then adding the controls, cooling, and oil and fuel systems to them. When the prescribed number of aircraft were done, then I went back to, I moved to the main plant and on Burbank there, and I worked there until 1955
What type of stuff would you
on
do?
various products. One would finish, and we would go to the next one, and that would finish. And then we started to run out of work, and that's when I was offered a job at Rocketdyne at the fuel laboratory.
So what type of projects would those be? Just as
We're
at Lockheed, because you were there for a number of years. So what, give me an example of what, I want to understand what you actually did.
Let's let's give an example. We got one contract to change some some 2-engine passenger planes. I forget what the make of them was, but the Air Force had ordered maybe 20 or 25 2-engine passenger planes, and they wanted to train navigators in it. So across the top of the airplane, they put in about 6 or 7 plexiglass domes in the top of them. Then what they would do would take navigator trainees, and they would fly up, and they could stick their head up in the domes while the airplanes were flying and use navigation instruments to learn how to navigate by the sun and the stars. And apparently when they had trained enough navigators, the Air Force was done with the airplanes. Now they wanted to, apparently they had a buyer who wanted to buy them a surplus, but what the Air Force had to do was take the domes out. And what we did, they took the airplanes out, and we would take the domes out and all the skin off the top of the fuselage and have to re-skid them like they were originally built. And since the airplanes were pressurized, it was doubly difficult to do this. We would get the skin of the airplanes, and they were pre-cut to the proper size, and remove the old skin and replace them with new skin, which meant drilling out the skins to the existing holes in the plane structure and attaching it with the clecos. A cleco is a little pin-like instrument where you could hold 2 pieces of metal together. You'd insert them with a special pliers, and it held things temporarily together until you took out the cleco and replaced them with a rivet. So that was one of my first jobs, and we had contracts to overhaul airplanes, that is, dismantle them and rebuild them, modify some aircraft. As an example, a bunch of Lockheed patrol planes, Neptune patrol planes. They were 2-engine airplanes. They wanted to modify them by putting a small jet engine on the underside of the wing, on each wing, to increase their power. so they can haul more fuel off the ground and increase their range. So we adapted the airplanes to small jet engines. And we also had a contract with some Lockheed C-121 planes which were actually military versions of the Lockheed Constellation, and in which they were made with big radar domes on the bottom, the big one on the bottom and the smaller one on top, in which they would fly at high altitudes and to search the sky around them for unfriendly aircraft. It was just one job after another. Another job we had was servicing Eisenhower's transport plane. It was named, let's see, what is the state flower of Colorado?
I do not know that, but I can tell you in one moment.
What is the state flower of Colorado?
Colorado blue.
Thank
Columbine.
you, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, it was called the Columbine. Now, Eisenhower's wife, I believe might have been from Colorado. I don't know. Anyway, she's the one that named it the Columbine. While I was there, we had two occasions to overhaul the plane. It would come in about every two months, every 3 months for servicing. And I was picked to be on that crew. There were about 18 or 20 of us. It was just really routine things. And then on another occasion, we had a DC-3 that crashed into the Lockheed Aircraft Service department. It landed in an area where incoming aircraft were parked, and they were prepared for overhauling. That is, liquids had been drained out of them, and they had been dismantled, and all the paint had been removed from them. So what they did, they had a crew of men in which they would brush a chemical paint remover on the exterior surfaces of the aircraft, and then they would wash it off with a water chemical mixture to strip the paint from the aircraft. Well, this aircraft was this DC-3 was trying to land at Lockheed, at the airport at Lockheed Airport there, and it was overcast that morning. He lost his way, and he thought he was approaching the runway. And when he came out of the fog and saw he was nowhere near the runway, he tried to pull him up and stalled and crashed. Actually, what happened? There were 8 or 9 people that were injured. If I remember right, nobody was killed in it. The plane did not catch fire. It was a remarkable thing. My memory is still pretty clear on that, but nobody was killed. There were a lot of hurt people. No buildings were damaged. There were several planes that had some damage under them. So
Okay.
that I worked there again till the fall of 45 and went on to
To Rocketdyne.